You know, listening to podcasts is awfully like drinking a pint. Having one is fine, but it's more fun to have a second. Hi, this is Andrew from the podcast Pop Culture Brews, and you are listening to Homebrewing DIY. After this episode, why don't you come and join me and my co-host Tyler as we do deep dives on pieces of pop culture we absolutely love, and then at the end of our episodes, we reveal to you the beer we were inspired to brew by it. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, anywhere really where you get your podcasts. So why don't you come and join us and have a pint?
Beer is a very old beverage. It's been consumed throughout the ages, and like all historical subjects, it helps us to better understand human history. So today, we're talking to Rob DeSalle, curator of the American Museum of Natural History in New York City, and he is the co-author of a great book called A Natural History of Beer. And we're going to talk to him about his book and the history of beer today on Homebrewing DIY. Keeping a clean brewery is the key to making great beer that doesn't get contaminated. Do you use a glass or plastic carboy for your fermentation? Did you know that getting your carboy clean can be tough, especially removing the crucian ring? Even with traditional carboy cleaning tools, it can take a lot of time and not get your carboy completely clean. Well, today there's a new tool that can easily clean your carboy and do it fast. And that tool is called a scrubber ducky. Scrubber duckies are a new magnetic carboy cleaner that are easy to use and get the cleaning results required in brewing. Drop a magnetic scrubber into your carboy and be able to scrub away all of the grime and that hard to clean crucian. They are no match for scrubber duckies, and you can get yours today at scrubberduckies.com. Once again, head over to scrubberduckies.com. Building recipes and taking good notes are two of the key fundamentals of making great beer. This is one of the first things that you learn when becoming a new brewer. I started taking notes on a sheet from my extract kit and then quickly moved to brewing software. I've tried many different types of brewing software, and then I found Brewfather. This is the one piece of software that you need for recipes and very detailed brew day notes, as well as fermentation notes. Brewfather also integrates with some of the topics that we discuss on this show, like the till hydrometer, the ice spindle, and ferment track. You need no other piece of software than Brewfather. One of the best parts of Brewfather is that you can try it for free. All you need to do is head to our website, homebrewingdiy.beer, and click on the Brewfather banner to sign up for free today. Once again, that's homebrewingdiy.beer and sign up for Brewfather today. Have you ever wanted to make a podcast? Do you have a subject you want to discuss with listeners? Do you even know where to start? Well, if you want to make a podcast and you want to get started now, I could not recommend Anchor enough. Anchor is the easiest way to make a podcast. Anchor gives you everything you need in one place for free, which you can use right from your phone or computer. Creation tools allow you to record and edit your podcast so it sounds great. They'll distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard everywhere: Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and many more. And you can easily make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. Hey, look, I shopped around for a place to post my podcast, and Anchor was the easiest, most streamlined experience you could ask for. So if you're looking for a place for your new podcast, download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Once again, download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. And welcome back to Homebrewing DIY, the podcast that takes on the do-it-yourself aspect of homebrewing. Gadgets, contraptions, and parts, this podcast covers it all. Today, we're talking to Rob DeSalle, curator of the American Museum of Natural History, about his book, A Natural History of Beer. We discuss beer history and how that history affects current brewing trends. But first, I want to thank all of our patrons. It's because of you that we can keep this show coming to you week after week. Head on over to patreon.com/homebrewing DIY and give it any amount. Your monthly support keeps this show on the air. I want to thank our newest patron, Ian Herbert. He gave it the supporter level, and he's going to get a really nice brewing gift from our sponsor, Scrubber Duckies. If you want to support the podcast, head over to patreon.com/homebrewing DIY today. Another way to support the podcast is to go to ratethispodcast.com/homebrewing DIY and write us a review. It helps others find the show. Speaking of reviews, we got a 3-star review last week because of the audio quality of our interview with Olivia. And I totally agree, the quality was really poor. I actually did the whole interview with my mic pointing the wrong direction. I've since fixed the issue, but I'm also working on audio issues altogether, so hopefully we don't run into anything like that anymore. Speaking of feedback, I also got some feedback from Ed in response to his feedback from a few weeks ago. And Ed wrote, "Coulter, I was surprised and a bit embarrassed to hear you read my email on the show." Well, here we are reading it again. You asked for info on the mill. Well, the big roller is hand cranked. The thing that weighs about 30 pounds and has a lot of inertia when it gets going. The smaller roller is 2 1/4 inches exhausted pipe with the ends cut from a 14-gallon steel welded in. Most of the rest is salvage stuff, a pulley from an old washer, a hand crank from a food grinder, lumber from a TV stand, miscellaneous hardware from my junk drawer. You kind of get the idea. The rollers used my non-patent pending variable roller spacing technology, i.e. I can't get it exactly parallel and to pull the grain through. It works pretty well considering, and it mills 10 to 12 pounds of grain in about 5 to 7 minutes or so. So keep up the great work, and cheers, Ed. Well, I want to thank Ed for the feedback. He sent me actual photos of this grain mill, and it's pretty cool. So if any of you want to check it out, head over to homebrewingdiy.beer, and it's in the show notes of this actual episode. I'll actually post the images that Ed sent me. So Ed, once again, thanks for the feedback. I truly enjoy reading it and hearing from you about your cool projects. And did you know that you can find the show on social media? We're on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Look for the handle @homebrewingdiy, all one word. The last way you can support the show is by supporting our sponsors from our website. Head over to homebrewingdiy.beer and click on our sponsor links. It lets them know that we sent you, and then they support us. All right, let's jump into our show for this week as we talk to Rob DeSalle about the natural history of beer. I'd like to welcome Rob DeSalle to Homebrewing DIY. Hi, Rob. How are you?
I'm doing great. Really glad to be here.
Yeah, great. I'm really glad to have you on the show. And the cool thing about Rob is he and his partner, Ian, they wrote this really amazing book called The Natural History of Beer. That came out about a year ago, right?
That's correct, yeah. Yeah, it was a project that Ian and I undertook to kind of look at natural history through the lens of beer. Basically because we like to drink beer, and we're both curators at a natural history museum, and so we felt it'd be a lot of fun to drink beer and try to teach people about natural history.
Yeah, and it's a really great read for anyone listening to the show. I'll definitely put a link to the book in the show notes. But this is a really fascinating take on the history of beer, because the idea is that the book kind of starts at the beginning of time in brewing in general, all the way back to the animal kingdom, right?
Yeah, that's right. And you know, a lot of animals, primates, and even small mammals, imbibe in drinking alcohol. Our closest primate relatives are pretty good. Chimpanzees are pretty good drinkers. They like to imbibe in alcohol every once in a while, and our smaller mammal relatives like tree shrews and other small mammals happen upon fermenting fruit, and so they'll eat and drink the fermenting fruit, and they'll get a little bit of a buzz from that. There's a hypothesis about how humans actually evolved called the drunken monkey hypothesis, which suggests that we developed kind of as our human lineage kind of evolved as a result of our ancestors focusing on plants and fruits that could ferment, and this kind of drove a bit of our evolution. So, you can take this idea of drinking and imbibing in our lineage pretty far back, and more than likely our human ancestors, say our ancestors with Neanderthals and our ancestors with Homo erectus, were more than likely finding alcoholic things to drink. So it goes back pretty far.
Yeah, one of the things that I was kind of cool for me in the book was the fact that there are a lot of species out there that can actually even process alcohol, and actually our primates and humans are actually unique in that we've adapted the ability to do so, right?
Yeah, it's very cool. What happened in the common ancestor of chimpanzees and humans is there was a mutation in one of our genes called an alcohol dehydrogenase gene. It's a very important gene if you like drinking beer and wine and spirits, because it helps to detoxify the alcohol in the body. And this mutation allowed our lineage and the chimpanzee lineage to be much more efficient at processing alcohol. And so we were a bit pre-adapted to our predilection for drinking alcohol and alcoholic beverages. But other primates, as you pointed out, don't have this change, and so they're much more susceptible to alcohol. In fact, some researchers in South America have observed howler monkeys drinking fermenting fruit and actually getting very, very drunk and falling asleep. So our lineage, again, is special as a result of this mutation in the alcohol dehydrogenase. It probably occurred about 10 million years ago, again, in the common ancestor of chimpanzees and humans.
Wow, that's a really long time ago. And really one of the other parts is that you guys then jump into talking about really ancient beers, and specifically you talk about like the Sumerians and Babylonians and how they made alcoholic beverages. And yes, they call it beer, but it's not really beer we would call today, right?
No, it's very different from the beer that we drink nowadays. It's even very different from the beer that was drunk during the Renaissance and the beer that was drunk by Europeans prior to the Renaissance till about 1000 AD, and that's when hops started to be used. So the beer that the Sumerians were drinking and the Egyptians were drinking, very different because it just didn't use hops, and it played around more with spices and herbs and things like that as additives to the beer. But it would have been a very different tasting thing. We know that the age of, or we know that brewing beer goes back pretty far from finding pottery and shards of vessels that would carry beer and wine and things like that. And we have a pretty good idea from archaeological sites where at what point in time humans were developing a beer. It kind of was more than likely developed along the same time as bread. People don't really know if bread came first or beer came first or wine came first. It probably all happened around the same time, and as humans started to come together into communities and into large living groups, humans had more time to play around and to figure out new ways of making things, of making food. And a lot of our discovery of these foods like bread and beer and wine were more than likely serendipitous. They were more than likely a mistake. You know, you leave something sitting around a little bit too long, you come back and, hey, you got beer. Or you leave it too long and come back, hey, you got wine. It's a really interesting way to think about beer and about how the making of beer kind of evolved. I wanted to also point out that I spent some time in Australia, and the Australian natives, the Aboriginals, so to speak, also made beer. This is a really interesting thing because they've been in Australia for 50 to 60,000 years. Now, it's not clear that they were making beer for 60,000 years, but they've probably been making beer for a long time. It's a very weak beer that's around 2 to 3%, made from eucalyptus and from other plants that the Aboriginals realized they could get to ferment. But the European age is around 10 to 12,000 years ago, and like I'm trying to point out, the Australian Aboriginal folk may have been drinking beer way before Europeans were drinking beer. So certainly the history of drinking beer in Homo sapiens, our species, is quite rich and quite old.
That's a great thing to kind of point out, is that even when you have societies that aren't connected in any way, they're still producing alcoholic beverages, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's almost like alcoholic beverages are really important for culture. It's not almost like, it is like that the alcoholic beverages are important for cultures. They're cultural kind of stimulators. They help cultures survive, and they do so because they break down inhibitions, and these inhibitions that get broken down allow for more social cohesion, and also allows for big problems, as we know from alcoholism problems in lots of societies. But for the most part, alcohol, beer especially, wine also, they play a big role in how societies and cultures get formed, and a big part of how societies and cultures survive.
Yeah, they kind of, depending on how the culture can create certain laws and how they maybe approach alcohol, could be a big reason for how the social aspect of alcohol is used. I think one of the things you talked about in the book is that, I think in Australia you were talking about the fact that there were, in trying to control alcohol consumption, they did things like, let's close the pub at 6 p.m. and it kind of backfired, right?
Yeah, exactly. It caused a binge drinking trend in Australia. What would happen is they wouldn't close the pub; they would just stop serving beer, and they would just stop serving new beers. And so what folks would do is they'd go to belly up to the bar 15 minutes before and buy 4 or 5 pints and take them to their table and pound them down before they got on the train or before they got on their bus to go home. And so this caused a problem in Australia. I mean, they tried to solve their alcohol problem differently than we did. We went through prohibition for about 10, maybe 12 years in the 1920s and into the 30s, and that caused a huge amount of social problems here in the United States with prohibition. So, there's a give and take that's very interesting around all of this, and one that really points to the fact that beer, alcohol, wine is a pretty important part of how we do culture, how we think about our cultures.
Yeah. Thinking about prohibition, I think prohibition had profound effects in general on the United States beer production, right? There was a different culture in the United States pre-prohibition and post-prohibition. because of that abstinence for 10 years, or at least non-commercialization for 10 years, how did that really affect the the beer industry before? What did it look
Oh
like
yeah.
in America, and then what
Oh
did it look like after Prohibition?
yeah. Here in New York City, well, of course, the beer capitals of the United States were in the Midwest, in Milwaukee and St. Louis, and the Midwestern town Chicago. But here in New York City, just as an example, where I live, there were thousands of breweries in all of New York City. Thousand. And Prohibition hit, and then when Prohibition was lifted, there were something like six left. And the way that they survived through Prohibition was through making malt. And of course, they probably cheated on the side and made a lot of alcohol, a lot of beer and stuff on the side. But they tried to stay open, these breweries did, by making malt and malt products, and they did so. So after Prohibition, the whole brewery industry was just kind of wiped down to very few breweries. And that's probably why the big brewers, the big guys, took over, and were such a big influence in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s even. It's only very recently that the craft brew movement has kind of risen up and challenged some of the big brewers. But yeah, the Prohibition had a huge impact on breweries here, certainly in New York City, but all over the United States, and as well in Australia. I spent about a half year in Australia, and it's very clear they're up to around 600 craft brewers now, and say 50 years ago, because of their 6 o'clock law, breweries dropped to just a few of the big breweries. But now they're up pretty with a lot of craft brewers. So yeah, it has a huge effect on how the trends in brewing have kind of formed over the years.
Yeah, and if we go back to kind of the natural progression of brewing and how we kind of got to where we are today, we were talking about the ancient world and how beer wasn't really what it was today. When do you think that beer became, I guess, you said that hops came at a certain time. When were hops added to beer, and that's kind of when beer became what we think of as modern beer, right?
Yeah, we discussed this in the book, and I'm blanking on the exact date, but it's probably around 1000 AD, 1100 AD, where hops were introduced to brewing in Germany and Great Britain. There's fairly good documentation as to when this happened, and then of course you get into the German purity laws, the Reinheitsgebot, a little bit after that, where the law says that beer is made up of water, hops, and barley, and anything else that you make has to either get dispensation or you can't call it beer. Britain didn't have that kind of a law. Neither did the Belgians and other folk, but it certainly had a big impact over the last, say, 1,000 years on brewing. The introduction of hops, and then this kind of forcing the three ingredients on brewing in Germany. So it certainly, though, over the last, say, 40 or 50 years, the use of hops has just exploded, and people are really taking advantage of the beautiful diversity of that plant. So there's a big difference there too.
Yeah, and once those kind of the German style of beer started to come out, it did start with the top fermenting ales, and then worked its way into bottom fermenting lagers. How did that switch kind of happen?
Yeah, I think it's more of a traditional. The weather in Germany probably had something to do with it. The capacity to ferment at lower temperatures in Germany probably had something to do with it. Tradition probably had something to do with it. Also, the availability of certain kinds of yeast, because it's the yeast that really is making the difference there, right? It's the bottom fermenting yeast are the lagering yeast, and the top fermenting yeast are the ale yeast and the stout and porter kinds of yeast. So, maybe the yeast in Germany started to lean more toward lagering kinds of yeasts, and the yeast in England stayed more toward ale-ish kind of yeast, the top fermenting kinds of yeast. So it probably got a lot to do with, again, as I said, tradition, but also maybe the availability of certain kinds of yeasts.
Yeah.
I don't know if your listeners are going to know about the yeast that the Scandinavian countries are producing now. The farmhouse yeast that they're producing up there are spectacular. So they're starting to produce really, really wonderful beers because of the local yeast that they can kind of find during their brewing processes. So where you are has a lot to do with the kind of brewing that you're going to be doing.
Yeah, we're talking about the Kvike yeast from
The
Norway.
Weiss yeast.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and we talk about it on this show. It seems to be coming up almost every other show right now, just because that though that yeast is uh, to those in Norway an ancient or a yeast that's been used for hundreds and hundreds of years. I think in the modern brewing world, it's really something that's brand new, and it's, to be honest, specifically for homebrewers, it really kind of affects a lot of the aspects that we push so hard on, things like temp control. Well, Kavite can
Yeah.
brew a clean beer at warm temperatures, right?
Right.
And it can also do a beer in 4 days, and you can have a beer grain
It's
to glass,
fast.
and yeah, super fast, and it can
It's
do it with a
fast.
really big beer, right? So
Yeah.
it's really kind of a yeast that's really very different and unique in the way that it behaves in comparison to your classic brewer's yeast, your classic ale yeast, your classic lager yeast, right? And so
Yeah, absolutely.
it's really actually kind of cool to see that become a thing as a home brewer, and to be able to kind of see something really change in the brewing world and watch it change, because
Yeah, it's been a big, like you say, a big development. And I don't know if I'm going to be too technical here, but the yeasts that are used in brewing, all of them have had their genome sequenced, which means we know all of the genetic machinery that every yeast that's used to make beer. We know the genetic machinery, and it turns out that Quebec yeasts have evolved rapidly, really, really fast. They're really different from each other, and they're even more different from all other yeasts. Whereas if you go to say wine yeasts almost all look alike. There's very little variability in wine yeasts, and then you look at other beer yeasts, and they're somewhere in between. So what's happened with the Norwegian yeast is that they've been allowed to just go nuts. There have been very little domestication, very little interference by humans in how those yeasts in Scandinavia have changed over, say, the last 2 millennia, 3 millennia. Whereas wine yeasts, what has happened is the vintners have kind of trained those yeasts to do certain things. They've kind of domesticated them and made them fairly uniform. And then beer brewers that are in the middle have let their ale yeasts and their lager yeasts go not as fast as the Scandinavians have, but has let them go so that they're somewhere in between domesticated and absolutely wild, like the Scandinavian yeasts are. So that's an aspect that you should keep in mind and one that I think is really important for people brewing beer. That is that we are on the cusp of knowing exactly what these little guys, these little single-celled organisms that are so important for making beer, knowing almost every aspect about them. I mean, it's pretty spectacular what the genomics guys have done with the beer yeasts and understanding them.
It's pretty cool to kind of see that almost happen in real time. It's really an amazing thing. Yeah, and then one we'll go back to the book a bit and talk about going back to the ales. One of the things that you talked about in the book was the production of porter, and how porter was kind of the first real mass produced beer when it came to really large scale, right?
Yes, yeah, and that's due to the Brits and their just or their preference for that style of beer. And again, what happens in cultures is that certain kinds of beers get preferred over others, and those kinds of beers kind of take over and kind of give a culture like Great Britain a a kind of a character or a characteristic, and that's the porter idea. A lot of beers. Well, you if I think about my father and his beer drinking, it was all Budweiser or all Midwestern American lagers, right? And America got characterized like that. And it's only in the last couple decades that we've been able to kind of break away from that. And even though the big brewers are still very influential, we're not looked upon as Bud drinkers or Pabst drinkers anymore. We're looked upon as fairly sophisticated with our preferences for beer.
Though the German style. But the German style lager like that, where we ended up making the American light lager, really, that has really influenced brewing globally. Though, when you talk about mass produced beer, like in Japan and other, even China, right?
Absolutely, yes. And to go back to this idea of locality having a lot to do with the culture, and the culture kind of defining or characterizing a people. Water has a lot to do with all of this too. So there's areas in Europe where water hardness and softness they're very different. So like in Czechoslovakia, around the town of Pils, where Pilsners were created, the water is incredibly soft. It's about the softest water on the planet. And with that, and I'm sure your listeners know that what that means is that there's very little mineral content in the water. But you can go 500, 600,000 kilometers to the west and be in Great Britain and see some of the hardest water that is on the planet. So, like for instance, in Great Britain, the tradition is to brew ales and porters, as we're discussing. And the reason that they like brewing those in Great Britain is the water that they had was very, very hard, and so they had to somehow deal with using that hard water to brew their beer. And ales and porters were very conducive to being brewed in very, very hard water. You can go to Ireland, to Dublin, and in Dublin the water is fairly hard, and that's where Guinness is a tradition. Then you go back to Germany again, and the water's fairly soft down in Bavaria, and so you get these softer, clearer, more crystal clear beers like lagers and pilsners. So you do have kind of natural things too that kind of dictate culture. So Germans are known for their pilsners, and their Czechs are known for their pilsners, and Germans are known for their lagers, and Brits are known for their ales, and the Irish are known for their stouts. And they wouldn't be known for those things unless they had to deal with the water that they were doing. And nowadays, and I learned this from looking at a lot of breweries here in the United States. Nowadays, brewers will bring in water and distill out all the minerals, or bring in really very soft water. And if they want to make an ale, of course, and a lot of home brewers know this too, you bring the mineral content up and then you make your beer. So that whole regional thing of lagers in Germany and ales in Great Britain, that's probably going to go away, because now we can brew beer anywhere we want with any kind of water we want. So we can manipulate the water to the point where we don't have to worry about what the local water is like.
Yeah, well, and that's exactly how I brew beer. I buy distilled water or reverse osmosis water, and I bring it home, and that's what my base is: zero, right? Zero mineral content. And then depending on the style of beer, if I'm going to make an IPA, I'm going to put more gypsum in it. If I'm going to brew, though, with the New England IPA that's more hazy, that's going to have a little more, calcium carbon, more nitrates in it, right? And so,
yeah, exactly.
So the idea is that that customization of water really, I agree, is part of the style, right? But the other part of it is, that yes, the craft brewers specifically in the States, and I think in other countries as well, you can now manipulate your water to be whatever you want. And even in Great Britain, even if you were to go to one of their breweries, even today, they still add additives to their water. They actually might even bring up the mineral content even more, right? To bring out that maltiness and to really make it pop. And so I think that's one of the things that when we talk about brewing and the chemistry of brewing and the science of brewing, is that they have that ability to really hone in and almost intensify the effect of what they're trying to do with like water additives, right?
Exactly. Yeah, and imagine brewing 200 years ago in England or in Czechoslovakia. You were kind of cornered into brewing a specific kind of a beer. You didn't have that luxury of that modern craft brewers and modern home brewers have of adjusting the water and then brewing exactly what you want, or brew a lager one week and a stout the next week. So it's and the other interesting thing, I hope I made the point. The other interesting thing is that the culture of beer drinking was dictated by the locality, and now I think we're gonna see that disappear, which is a shame, is a kind of a shame, but in many ways I think it's better for beer drinking to be able to have this variety and this capacity to go in different directions.
I agree with that, but when we talk about the culture of at least the culture of drinking in a way that is more social, I think that right now in the United States we're kind of at a renaissance, right? I think that when we looked at the culture post prohibition, and we spent so many years drinking the standard American light lager. That also was around a time when people weren't really going to bars all the time, right? And if you were kind of like a loner going to a bar. And whereas we're now in a case where drinking is a social occasion again, and people go to bars for the reason to be social. And then there's so many different styles of brewery for so many different types of beer. If you're super into lagers, you can go to a brewery that just does lagers. If you want British ales on cask, you can go to a brewery if you live in a big enough city and actually have that, right? So it's kind of and we're getting hyper specialization, but with that is kind of an entire culture that's being built in itself around craft beer.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a different culture than, say, what existed even 50 years ago, where the preferences of people were very regionalized. Now I think you're right. You're 100% right, because craft brewers can do what they do, and some of the big brewers can do what they can do. The diversity across localities, across cultures is increasing, and I think it's like I say, there's some advantages to seeing that having some impact on culture, but there's also the huge advantage of the variety and the ability to just drink what you want to drink when you go to a brewery or when you go to a bar.
Yeah.
It's a very different world than it was 50 years ago. Really different than it was 50 years ago.
It's really, really different and kind of crazy to see. Kind of randomly, when I grew up, my mother owned a bar until I was 14 years old in the middle
Ah,
of the 80s. And the description in the book where you talk about how going to a bar was almost kind of stigmatized in the United States post-prohibition. People drink at home, right? And I just feel like that's just changed now. You go to a brewery, they're packed, they're filled with people that are
yeah,
enjoying beers, and it's just back to being a social thing. And it's something that I think we're now in a place to where we're getting that kind of beer culture that it's almost like I kind of feel like prohibition put the brakes on American beer culture for 50 years, not 10.
yeah, yeah. I think you're right about that, and the whole beer culture. I love that term actually, and the beer culture here in the United States, and the beer culture in Australia, and the beer culture in England, and the beer culture in Europe, beer culture in Japan. I just love the idea of the beer cultures, and again, it's wonderful because what we have is a capacity to experience all this wide variation of beers, and we're not kind of penned into drinking all lagers or drinking all pilsners. Even though if you go to Czechoslovakia, that's probably what you want to do. But um, it's really a great time. It certainly is.
Yeah, it's kind of a really it's a cool thing to see and to have been kind of part of. What's next for you guys when it comes to writing? Are you done doing beer and wine history books? What kind of what kind of things are you guys working on?
Well, we actually have a contract to do a natural history of spirits to kind of round out things. And again, the natural history of spirits is really kind of a cool thing, because there's so many different kinds of spirits on the planet. And again, the spirits are very highly localized and highly kind of culturally cemented. You have vodkas from Eastern Europe, and you have scotches from Great Britain and Ireland, and you have tequilas and from Mexico, and chachachas from South America. It's going to be a lot of fun, and I don't know if you're well, you've taken a look at the book, and we start each chapter with a little description of a beer that we drink that kind of leads us into the chapter, and I'm really looking forward to hitting the spirits and leading into the chapters in the spirits book. So it should be
Sounds
a lot
like
of
you're going to
fun.
get to drink a little bit of whiskey.
Yeah, just a little bit, I hope. Just a little
Yeah.
bit.
Well, it is kind of cool. And one of my favorite jokes I tell is to all my friends, and I have a lot of people that are into beer, obviously into whiskey. I live in Colorado, and half of them smoke weed too. So, but the point is that
Well, that's the fourth book. The
that'll
Natural
be the
History of
fourth book. Will
Cannabis.
be
So
the
yeah,
history of marijuana. But yeah. So, but when we talk about spirits, particularly, like for example, you go to England, it's not called Scotch; it's just called whiskey. Whereas here, if we talk about whiskey, it's a brown liquor from the South. And so
yeah,
it's kind of funny how hyper localized whiskey still is, and spirits still are. And I think that yes, craft distilling is becoming a thing, but I think craft distilling right now, at least in the United States, and this is just an observation and probably wrong, but I think that craft distilling now is where brewing was in the United States 30 years ago, right? It's
yeah.
more
I exactly. You could actually even go out on a limb and say that home brewing is the key to all of it. I think home brewing stimulated the craft brewing movement, and I don't. I mean, I could be wrong about this, but I don't think you'd have craft brewing without home brewing. And I think with spirits, you have very few home brewers, home spirit brewers. And I think that what is needed is maybe a home brewing spirit kind of movement to really kind of get the craft spirit brewing.
That's really taken off now. Though I'll be very clear as I'm on a podcast, to distill spirits in the United States is against the law. So I'm going to say that now. But if you were to, for example, there's these all-in-one brewing systems that we have now, like the Grainfather and the Mash and Boil, right? They're they're easily accessible home brewing systems. Well, one of the cool things, and I'll use Grainfather as an example, is you can buy a distilling top for it, right? And so it's a lot more approachable than it used to be in the fact that you can just buy the distilling top. It's a lid you put on, and it's basically converts that homebrewing setup into a still. And so it's kind of something where we're now kind of at a place where the technology is kind of brought it to where it's accessible to people. And you're starting to see a really big craft distilling movement that is driven by people who are doing it at home. And it usually starts with somebody who's homebrewing as well.
Yeah, and I think that's, again, a very important aspect of how craft brewing became so popular. Again, I don't think it would be without home brewing. I think home brewing's been a very, very important cog in the getting us to the point of beer culture.
That's awesome. Well, I will make sure that when your spirits book comes out, I will get a copy and read it, and maybe we'll have you back on the show. And
that'll be fun.
Yeah, and Rob, thank you so much for coming on to Homebrewing DIY. I think that this was a really informative conversation and a great chat. And like I said, anyone who's listening to the show, head over, look at the show notes, look at if you head over to our website, I'll have links to the book. It's definitely a book worth checking out. It's not a huge read. This is not a 600-page book. This is a few hundred pages. You could read it in a couple of days, but it's a great read.
Yeah, there was too much beer to drink and so little time.
Well, Rob, thanks for coming on the show, and really look forward to talking to you again.
Yeah, thank you, Coulter. You take care now.
I want to thank Rob for coming on the show. I don't know about you, but I learned a ton. If you want to learn more about their book, head over to homebrewingdiy.beer. I'll have a link to Amazon so you can find their book, A Natural History of Beer. You can also follow us on social media, on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. Look for our handle at homebrewingdiy, all one word. Well, that's it for this week, and we'll talk to you next week on Homebrewing DIY.